Hey everyone, Wags here from Eagle Dynamics. In our next open beta update, we plan to release updates for both the Viper and Hornet Litening targeting pods. The Viper pod received many improvements, including cursor 0, improved HOTAS commands, air-to-air mode, and it now much better matches its real-world counterpart. For the Hornet pod, we've added several new items by popular demand, like a coordinate display and the north arrow. Let's get started. Okay, so before we jump into the aircraft, let's take a look at some of the controls that we'll be using. So our aircraft is the S16C sim, and as always, if you're going to use the sim, always make sure in the gameplay tab that the flight mode and the avionics mode are not checked. Go back to controls. Now, in terms of finding the controls, there's two ways best to do this. One is to search, so we could do like a TMS, target management switch. Just put in target, it automatically pops up this way. Or we're going to be using just the HOTAS commands. So we can go to the HOTAS category. And we have it here. Okay, so first let's take a look at the stick commands. First going to be DMS and TMS. So TMS is the target management switch, and the DMS is the display management switch. So here we have DMS down, left, right, and up, and then coming down we have the TMS, target management switch, down, left, right, and up. The next one is the expand switch on the stick, which we find right here, expand FOV button, depress. And then to the throttle, the primary one we're going to use there is the manual range knob, and we have those right here, counterclockwise and clockwise. So those are the major key commands we're going to be using for this little mission. Okay. All right, so first let's take a look at the targeting pod changes in the Viper. And because I'm going to be head down quite a bit, let's go ahead and put on the altitude hold as well as the steering select. So this will maintain my current altitude as well as have the aircraft fly directly to the current steer point, which in this case is steer point 1, indicated by the filled in dot here on the HSD. So we can use the targeting pod in air-to-ground, air-to-air, and even nav mode, but for now let's go to air-to-ground mode. And we'll select CCRP mode so we can do an LGB delivery back to the HSD. On the left side, we'll turn on the laser, and we'll bring up the targeting pod on the left MPD. Now you'll notice that we have a not SOI message plastered here in the center, and that indicates not sensor of interest, meaning that the controls are in reference to a different display, either the right MPD or in the HUD. It's actually the HUD in this case. So to remedy that, we'll go aft on the DMS switch, and that switches the SOI between the right and left MFDs. So we have a bunch of new stuff to talk about here. First, we have our grayscale, which allows you to calibrate your display a bit better. Next, we have our coordinate display, lat, long, and elevation based on where the targeting pod is currently looking. And of course, once we have the mergs integrated, that will be an option as well. Above that, there's an option for manual and automatic Maverick handoff. To the right, we have our manual zoom, which is controlled by the manual range cursor. But also, to change the field of view, we can press the expand button on the stick. And you see narrow and wide. To the right, we have our north arrow. And it's not north arrow in regards to where our aircraft is pointed, but north in reference to where the targeting pod is looking. And there's another line, which is the ground plane. And the steeper the angle that the targeting pod is looking, the more difference you'll see in the north arrow from the ground plane. Now, of course, we have our options for the different cameras: TV, white hot, black hot, back to TV. But by pressing TMS left, we can also cycle these. Now, as we all know, once you bring up the targeting pod, it will automatically slave to the steer point. And then once you slew off that steer point, it's a bit difficult to get it back to where it was. And that's where the cursor 0 comes in play, or CZ. By pressing this, it'll automatically slave the targeting pod back to that slave location. In this case, this airfield, or sorry, this town up ahead. Now, also related, in earlier builds, when you slew the cursor, it would also, unfortunately, move the navigation steer point as well, and that, of course, has been fixed too. Here we have our meter stick, right now 32 meters or so, and this is in reference to the lines on the crosshairs. So right now we have 14 meters, and if we place this line right here at the base of this building, we can see that this building is probably what, about 15 meters or so, or about 13, 14 meters in length. Let's go ahead and go to the next steer point. This is the airfield. Expand back out. And here we have the SP, or snowplow mode. When that's selected, it'll automatically place the target pod looking down at 1/2 the length of the current range setting. And from this mode, you can still designate and move around. Let's cursor 0 back to the airfield again. Coming down as target, once we have offset aim points, we'll have the ability to cycle between the target and various offset aim points. Coming down here in the corner, we have a countdown timer. If there's no target designated for attack, it's the time to reach that steer point, which is also indicated here on the HUD. If you have it designated for weapon release, it's the time to weapon release, and the weapon is in the air, it's the time to impact. In the corner here, we have our steering indication, with the vertical line being the steering we're shooting for, and as long as that line is centered in the water line, we're actually flying to that steer point. If we're in one of the IR modes, say white hot, black hot, we can press AC, AGC, or automatic gain control, and this allows us, using the push buttons here with the arrow, to manually adjust the levels for those two cameras. Let me keep it in TV for now. To designate the camera, if you press and hold TMS forward, it goes to area mode, but once you release, it goes into a point track mode. However, if you go right on the TMS switch, press and release, it goes into an area track mode. So let's come down here and we'll designate this hangar in an area track. And we see about 24 seconds to release, and our distance based on the pod is about 7.5 miles. So lining up for release, 10 seconds to release. Release cue is coming down. Press and hold the weapon release button. And weapon away. So the button here now is the time to impact. Our range to it is about 3.5 miles. We're in area. And in about 15 seconds, I'm going to press and hold the weapon trigger to activate the laser. And we do that. We have a flashing L1688 indicating the laser designation code. Flashing L. And also the range also has an L indicating that the laser now is providing the range data. Impact. Okay, so that's a little overview of the expanded functions of the air-to-ground mode of the Viper targeting pod. Now let's take a look at the Viper targeting pod in air-to-air mode. Okay, so now let's take a look at using the targeting pod in the Viper in air-to-air mode. So you probably mostly use this for visual identification at longer ranges. First thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and go air-to-air mode, and we'll lock up the target using the FCR. And we do that, if we bring up the targeting pod now, it'll automatically slave the targeting pod to that designated radar target. So targeting pod on the right, we'll go DMIS aft to make this our SOI, expand field of view, and we'll do a little zoom in, and there it is. At this point, we'll go TMIS forward to initiate a point track. Okay, point track. And kind of like the Hornet, now we have a correlated track where both the radar and the targeting pod are tracking at the same time. But if we make the FCR soy and we break the radar lock, now just the targeting pod is tracking the target indicated by the broken box. And if we bring the target outside the HUD, we'll get a dashed line to that target with degrees off as it passes us. So those are the basics of using the Viper targeting pod in air-to-air mode. Next, let's take a look at some of the Hornet targeting pod changes. Now for the Hornet targeting pod, the changes aren't quite as extensive as say the Viper, but some nice changes nevertheless. To start, the brightness and contrast controls are much more useful now. You can really kind of dial in the levels that you're looking for. Up here in the top left corner, we have our coordinate display, latitude, longitude, and elevation based on where the targeting pod is looking. Of course, we have our north arrow, which indicates north at the location that the targeting pod is looking, and the other line is the ground plane. So again, as you increase the look angle, the separation between the north arrow and the ground plane will separate. And below that, we have our meter stick, which we can use the elements of the crosshair and the number here to get a pretty good feel about the size of ground objects. And as just a side note, for me, when I do a designation for targeting, generally just the standard INR designation is more than enough. It's very rare to ever have to do a area track or point track, and the only time I'd ever really do a point track is if I'm doing a moving target. Anyhow, folks, I very much hope you enjoyed this preview look at the targeting pod changes for both the Viper and the Hornet. I'll see you next time. Thanks.